In previous section we discussed the location of facilities in a supply chain and touched on closely related questions about the number and size of facilities. Managers may decide to build a single logistics center, and they not only have to decide where to put it, but also how big it has to be. Alternatively, they may decide to build a number of local warehouses, and again, they have to decide not only where to put them, but how big each one will be. There are three related decisions about facilities: the number, how many facilities to use, the location where to put them, and the size, how big each one is. Of course, using more locations means that each one is smaller. The other general rule is that large centralized facilities have lower costs for inward transport and economies of scale, giving lower operating costs. But these are balanced by higher costs for outward transport and worse customer service. More dispersed facilities have higher costs for inward transport and less efficient operations, but lower costs for outward transport and better customer service. Adding the costs of inward transport operations and outward transport gives an estimate of the total cost of using facilities. If we plot this against the number of facilities, we get a U-shaped curve with a minimum that identifies an optimal number of locations. Managers should only move away from this minimum if they are convinced that the benefits, perhaps better customer service or increasing economies of scale, are worth the additional cost. Let's explore an example. ABC Company is planning a new distribution system and has estimated the costs in units for transport and operations below. What do these numbers tell you? If you add the total cost for each number of locations and draw a graph of the result, you get the result shown in this figure. This shows that the total cost is U-shaped with a minimum corresponding to 5 warehouses. If the company uses either more or fewer locations, its cost will be higher. These three decisions form a central part of supply chain planning. They are strategic with long-term effects and lead to more detailed plans for the use of facilities. This is an important point as all activities in the supply chain have to be planned. We already show the broad approach to planning a supply chain, which starts with a logistics strategy to give the context and overall aims. Then a cascade of decisions downwards progressively adds more details to the plans and gives more immediate goals. So, senior managers translate the logistics strategy into long-term plans. Middle managers add details to get the medium-term tactical plans. Then junior managers add more details to give short-term operational schedules. This gives the standard approach to planning illustrated in this figure. The logistics strategy sets the scene for all planning decisions about logistics and leads to the three strategic decisions about facility plans, which, to be pedantic, actually form a part of the logistics strategy. These lead to tactical decisions, and in the same way that there are different types of strategic plans, there are also different types of tactical plans. People use different names for these, but the most common for supply chains are aggregate planning, tactical plans that summarize related activities typically by month at each location, master schedules, tactical plans that give timetables for each activity typically by week. Underneath these tactical plans are the operational schedules, short-term schedules, operational plans that give detailed timetables for all jobs and resources typically by day. Details of planning are different in every organization, but the key point is that each level of decision sets the context and goals for lower levels. And as the plans move down the organization, more details are continually added. In the next lectures, we concentrate on high-level capacity plans and discuss other levels of planning in the next section. The capacity of any operation is its maximum throughput in a specified time. All operations have some limit on their capacity. A factory has a maximum number of units it can make a week, a university has a maximum intake of students, a train has a maximum number of seats. Sometimes the stated capacity makes an explicit reference to time, such as a maximum number of customers that can be served in a day. Even when it is not mentioned explicitly, every measure of capacity refers to time. For instance, the number of seats on a bus sets the capacity for a particular journey, and the number of rooms in a hotel sets the maximum number of guests who can stay each day. Capacity is an important concept for logistics, as it defines the maximum flow through the supply chain in a given time. It sets the maximum amount of product that can be delivered to final customers. Most organizations do not like to work at full capacity, as this puts too much pressure on both resources and people. Instead, they work at a lower level that they can reasonably sustain over time. We allow for this disparity by defining different kinds of capacity. If you imagine a supply chain that is working in ideal conditions with no disruptions or problems of any kind, then the maximum throughput is its designed capacity. In reality, you seldom find such ideal conditions, and a more realistic measure is the effective capacity. This is the maximum throughput that can be sustained under normal conditions and allows for disruptions, variations in performance, breakdowns, maintenance periods, holidays, sickness, and so on. Then below this is the throughput actually achieved. A transport operation might have a designed capacity of 1,200 containers a week. It might achieve this for short periods, but taking into account disruptions and other effects, it's sustainable. Effective capacity is 1,000 containers a week. Last month, their actual throughput averaged 850 containers a week. Bottlenecks. A supply chain does not have a constant capacity along its length, but each operation has a different capacity. If the supply chain is well designed, the variation in capacity is small and the supply chain is said to be balanced. But there can be wide variation along an unbalanced chain. However much the capacity varies, there must be some point that limits the overall throughput of the chain, and this forms a bottleneck. A bottleneck is formed by the resources or facilities that limit the overall throughput of the chain. Now let's see an example. The bottling plant at ABC Company has a capacity of 80,000 liters a day and works a 7-day week. It fills standard bottles of 750 milliliters, and they are moved to a packing area which can make up to 20,000 cases a day with 12 bottles each and works a 5-day week. The cases are taken to the warehouse by a transport company whose 8 trucks can each carry 300 cases and make up to 4 trips a day for 7 days a week. There are 2 main warehouses, each can handle up to 30,000 cases a week. Local deliveries are made from the warehouses by a fleet of small vans that can handle everything passed to them from the warehouse. What is the capacity of this part of the distribution system, and how can ABC increase this capacity? We have the information about 5 parts of the supply chain and can find the capacity of each part in consistent units, say bottles a week. The bottling plant has a capacity of 746,666 bottles a week. The packing area capacity is 1,200,000 bottles a week. The transport company's trucks capacity has this capacity, 806,400 bottles a week. And then the warehouse capacity, we have 2 warehouses, 30,000 cases a week multiplied by 12 bottles in case, which gives us 720,000 bottles a week. We only know that the capacity of the delivery vans is greater than the capacity of the warehouses. The capacity of this part of the supply chain is the smallest of these separate capacities, and this is 720,000 bottles a week in the warehouse. So this is the bottleneck for the supply chain. ABC can only increase capacity by expanding the warehouses. Improving other parts of the supply chain will have no effect at all, except increasing spare capacity. If the capacity in warehousing is increased, another bottleneck will limit throughput, this time in the bottling plant. The bottleneck limits the overall capacity of supply chain, which means that this part is working at full capacity. Everywhere else could handle more, so it has unused or spare capacity. The more unbalanced the chain is, the more unused capacity it has away from the bottleneck. The only way to increase overall capacity is by adding more capacity at the bottleneck. This seems obvious, but you often see companies missing the point. For example, transport companies recruit more managers to give leadership when they are actually short of drivers. Bus stations increase the size of waiting rooms when congestion in arrival bays is limiting the number of buses. Manufacturers increase their marketing effort when they cannot deliver enough products to meet existing demand. You see an irritating example of this when you are waiting a long time to be served, perhaps in a bank, but can clearly see non-serving staff who are hanging around and apparently doing nothing useful. Capacity planning has to match the available capacity of facilities to the demands put on them. Any mismatch can be expensive. If capacity is less than demand, bottlenecks limit the movement of materials, some demand cannot be met, and customer service declines. If capacity is greater than demand, all materials can be moved, but there is spare capacity and resources are underused. The standard approach to capacity planning aims at matching available capacity to forecast demand. This uses forecasts to calculate the resources needed over a particular period, compares these with the resources actually available, and then consider ways of overcoming differences. To be more specific, it comprises the following 6 steps. Step 1 examines forecast demand and translates this into a capacity needed. Step 2 finds the capacity available in present facilities. Step 3 identifies mismatches between capacity needed and that available. Step 4 suggests alternative plans for overcoming any mismatch. Step 5 compares these plans and chooses the best. And last, step 6 implements the best plan and monitors actual performance. Let's now see an example and to see how this can work. ABC company delivers an average 100 computers a week to schools. The system have customized software installed, which takes 1 hour to test before delivery. The testing is done by 2 people who achieve an average efficiency of 75% and say that they are currently under pressure. They work a single 8-hour shift 5 days a week, but could move to double shifts or work overtime at weekends. How many testers should ABC employ? Now let's follow the 6 steps in the standard procedure we just described. Step 1. Find the capacity needed. We know this is to be 100 units a week. The next step, find the capacity available. Each tester is available for 8 multiplied by 5 or 40 hours a week. Average efficiency is 75%, so their useful time is 30 hours a week. Each computer takes 1 hour to test, so each tester can finish 30 systems a week. There are 2 testers, so the available capacity is 60 units a week. Step 3. Identify mismatches. ABC needs a capacity of 100 units a week and currently can handle 60 units a week, so there is a shortage of 40 units a week. The next step suggests plans for overcoming the mismatch. There are several ways of doing this. First, working a single shift on weekdays would need 100 divided by 30 or 3.33 testers or 4 testers. If ABC only employs full-time testers, they have to round this up to 4. Then the utilization of each would be 83%. Another option is 3 testers full-time and 1 tester part-time for 1/3 time would meet the total demand with 100% utilization. Another option is using overtime at the weekends would need 3 full-time testers who are willing to finish 10 tests at the weekend, working 10 divided by 0.75 or 13.3 hours. With more information, we could continue along these lines, suggesting alternative plans, adding allowances for holidays, problems, varying demand, and so on. The last 2 steps, choose the best and implement the best. So ABC would now have a reasonable set of alternative plans and could complete her capacity planning by comparing them and choosing the best. The final step in the procedure implements the best solution and monitors performance to make sure that it works properly. This standard approach to capacity planning can be extended to all types of planning, and it is often called resource requirements planning. But taking the steps in a straightforward sequence does not usually work. There can be a huge number of possible plans, and it is often impossible to list them all, let alone consider them in detail. At the same time, there are also so many competing objectives and non-quantifiable variables that it is difficult to find any plan that satisfies everyone, let alone identify the best. A more realistic view suggests that managers only consider a few reasonable plans and look at these in more detail. In essence, they give superficial consideration to a long list of options, but quickly home in on a short list of feasible ones and then choose the one that satisfies most of the requirements. This generally appears as an iterative procedure where managers design an initial plan and see how closely it gets to achieving their objectives. If the plan performs badly, they modify it to find improvements, in effect repeating steps 4 and 5 until they reach a reasonable solution. There are several problems with the planning procedures from the previous lecture. For instance, we rarely know what demand will actually be in the future, so we have to use forecasts. Unfortunately, these can be wrong, so the whole procedure is based on uncertain values. Another problem is finding the capacity. Supply chains are very complicated, so it may be difficult to identify the real bottlenecks and their constraints. A third problem is that capacity varies over time, and we'll return to this later in this course. Yet another problem is generating alternative plans, let alone evaluating them and getting agreement about their quality. Looking at the last problem, there are several ways of generating alternative plans. First, haggling and negotiating. Real conditions are so complex that formal analyses are often of little use. Then the best option might be to get people to negotiate and agree a plan. This may not be in any way optimal or even good, but it should have the support of everyone concerned. Intuitive and heuristic methods. These use simple rules that seem to give good results, such as general guidance to add 10% extra capacity to cover uncertainty. Adjust previous plans. Very few operations start entirely from scratch, so an obvious way of planning capacity is look at the current operations and identify any problems or changes to circumstances and make adjustments to improve things. This has the benefit of being relatively easy and giving stable operations. Spreadsheets. One of the most popular approaches to planning uses spreadsheets. Information can be presented in a variety of formats to show the consequences of a plan, and then managers can quickly adjust features to try a new solution, effectively doing a series of what-if analysis. Graphical methods. Planners often find it easier to work with some kind of graphs or diagrams. A popular format uses a graph of cumulative demand over time and the corresponding line of cumulative supply. The aim is to get the cumulative supply line nearly straight, giving constant throughput and as close as possible to the cumulative demand line. Next, simulation. This gives a dynamic view of a supply chain and follows operations through a series of typical periods. Suppose you want some information about a logistics network. You could simply stand and watch the network for some time to see what happens. Unfortunately, this takes a long time and things may not work normally while you're watching. An alternative is to simulate the process using a computer model of the network. Expert systems and artificial intelligence. These include managers' knowledge and judgment in an automated process using specialized systems to try and make computers duplicate some of the skills of human planners. Essentially, skills, expertise, decisions, and rules used by experts are collected in a knowledge base, and then a user passes a problem to an inference engine, which chooses the knowledge needed to find a solution. Mathematical programming and other mathematical models. Previous approaches rely on human judgment, but the mathematical analysis look for an objective optimal solution that gives the best possible performance. The most common approach uses mathematical programming. Unfortunately, this can be very complicated and it cannot deal with subjective and non-quantifiable factors. The most appropriate methods depends on several factors, the most obvious being the balance between the cost of planning and the expected benefits. If you are moving huge quantities of oil in tankers and pipelines, costs are high and it is worth putting a lot of effort into a sophisticated model that guarantees good results. On the other hand, a small business is unlikely to have the necessary resources and will use a simple method to give reasonable results with a lot less effort. The inherent difference between patterns of supply and demand means that there is rarely an exact match between them. Things become even more complicated as both demand and capacity vary over time. So the best managers can do is look for a reasonable match that is generally acceptable and then make short-term adjustments to cover any immediate problems. Suppose that the throughput of a supply chain rises steadily over time. Capacity should be increased at some point, but the increase will come as a discrete step. There is no way of exactly matching the discrete capacity to a continuous demand. So there are three alternatives. Capacity more or less matches demand, meaning that there is sometimes spare capacity and sometimes a shortage. This gives a relatively balanced performance that avoids the problems of both excess capacity and too many lost customers. Capacity leads demand, so that there is always enough capacity to meet all demand. This maximizes revenue and customer satisfaction, and there is a capacity cushion to allow for unexpected circumstances. But it needs more investment, utilization is lower, unit costs are higher, and there is a risk of having resources that are never used if the long-term forecasts are too optimistic. Capacity lags demand, with more capacity added only when the extra facilities would be heavily, preferably fully used. This delays and reduces investment, ensures high utilization and gives low unit costs. But it restricts throughput, loses customers, causes delays, lower customer satisfaction, and has no flexibility to deal with unexpected conditions. Each of these options is best in different circumstances. Factors that encourage an early increase in capacity include high cost of shortages, low cost of spare capacity, widely variable demand, high profit margins, varying efficiency, and capacity increases that are relatively small. On the other hand, the main factor that encourages a delay is the capital cost and the knowledge that resource would not be fully used until some point in the future. Some analysis can help with this decision, particularly in the costing of alternatives. We can look at the relative cost of excess capacity and shortage by using this calculation. When the cost of excess capacity is high, this ratio is small, which can be interpreted as meaning that there should be no spare capacity and preferably a shortage. When the cost of capacity shortage is high, this ratio is large, suggesting that there should be a positive capacity cushion. Unfortunately, such calculations often depend on measuring the cost of lost customers, and this is notoriously difficult. Another aspect in the decision to change concerns the size of changes. Extra capacity may come in discrete quantities, but it is better to keep increasing capacity in relatively small steps or to combine several of these into fewer, much bigger jumps, as shown on those pictures. If you want to hire 5 new people over the next few months, should you add them one at a time when needed, or would it be better to have one big campaign to recruit all 5 at the same time? There can be benefits to both of these approaches. The benefits from a few large increases include longer periods without disruptions, bigger expansions give lower cost per unit of expansion, less risk of not meeting unexpected demand, earlier economies of scale, incentives to encourage more demand, and so on. On the other hand, the advantages of more, smaller expansions include a closer match to demand, less serious disruptions, capital not being tied up in unused facilities, higher utilization of resources, less risk if demand changes or does not react expected levels, and so on. Capacity planning is largely a strategic function. Managers can increase the capacity of a supply chain by opening a warehouse, designing a new process, opening new offices, or moving to a new location. They can reduce excess capacity by closing warehouses, shutting down a plant, or transferring facilities to other products. These are strategic decisions with a long-term consequences. But capacity can also be adjusted in the shorter term by leasing extra space, working overtime, employing temporary staff, or so on. These are clearly tactical and operational decisions. A fairer picture of capacity planning says that the context is set at the strategic level, but superimposed on these are medium and short-term adjustments. Tactical decisions affect capacity over the medium term and typically adjust the number of people employed, responses to seasonal changes, and so on. Operational decisions affect capacity over the short term and typically look at employees' work schedules, amount of overtime, dealing with urgent problems, and so on. There are really two ways of making these adjustments. Supply management adjusts the available capacity to match known demand, and demand management, which adjusts the demand to match available capacity. Imagine a wholesaler warehouse that sees a temporary increase in business when a construction site opens nearby. The wholesaler can use supply management and rent extra space for the duration of the construction project, or it can use demand management to limit demand to match existing capacity, perhaps by raising prices. In practice, supply management is more usual, and this is achieved by the following. Change the work pattern to match demand, with overtime and undertime to make final adjustments. Hire or fire full-time staff. Employ part-time or temporary staff to cover peak demands. Cross-train employees so that each can move to the job that is most urgent. Use outside contractors or outsourcing. Rent or lease extra facilities. Adjust the speed of working. Reschedule maintenance periods or other backroom activities. Redesign operations to make them more efficient. These adjustments cannot be done too often or too severely, as they affect employees, operations, and customers. For instance, a company cannot change work schedules every few days, as this would be unacceptable to employees, and frequent changes to working hours would confuse customers. The alternative is demand management, and although this seems strange, it is surprisingly common. For instance, restaurants charge high prices to restrict numbers, professional institutions put up barriers to entry, and doctors insist on appointments. More generally, firms can vary the price, provided they remain high enough to cover costs but low enough to be competitive. Offer incentives to change demand patterns such as free samples, discounts, or off-peak rates. Change the marketing efforts. Change related products to encourage substitution. Vary the lead time. Use a reservation or appointment system. And use stocks to cushion demand. So far we assume that capacity is constant over time, but the effective capacity of a supply chain can change quickly due to staff illness, interruptions, breakdowns, accidents, weather, and so on. Even when there is no change to operations, the capacity can vary quite widely. The capacity of a supply chain is affected by both random effects and more systematic ones. Among the systematic changes is the well-known learning curve, which shows that the more often you repeat something, the easier it becomes and the faster you can do it. The usual shape for a learning curve has the time taken to do some activity falling by a fixed proportion, typically around 10%, every time the number of repetitions is doubled. If you take 10 minutes to do a job for the first time, the second time takes only 90% of the time, or 9 minutes. The fourth time takes 90% of the time for the second repetition, or 8.1 minutes, and so on. This table shows the times for repetitions with this 90% learning curve. Another reason for systematic changes to capacity is the effect of aging equipment and facilities. As equipment gets older, its effective capacity declines as it breaks down more often, develops more faults, gives lower quality, slows down, and generally wears out. Sometimes the changes are slow, like the fuel consumption of a car, which rises steadily with age. Sometimes the change is very fast, like a bolt which suddenly breaks. The overall effect, though, is a systematic decline in effective capacity with age. With preventive maintenance, equipment is inspected and vulnerable parts are replaced after a certain period of use. By replacing bits that are worn or are most likely to wear, the equipment is restored to give continuing satisfactory performance. The next question asks how often we should undertake this maintenance. If we do it too often, the equipment runs efficiently, but the maintenance costs are too high. If we do not do it often enough, the maintenance costs are low, but the equipment still breaks down. One way of finding the best compromise is to add together the cost of maintenance and expected failure. Then, plotting the total cost against the frequency of maintenance, we get a U-shaped curve with a distinct minimum that defines the best time between maintenance periods. Now let's see an example. ABC Company has recorded the cost of an automatic guided vehicle. The longer the AGV works without maintenance, the higher are the expected failure costs. The maintenance also affects the release value, giving a varying capital charge. Preventive maintenance can be done at a cost of 1,000, and this restores the AGV to its new condition. What is the best time between maintenance periods? We can find that the total monthly cost of running the AGV over some period by adding the total cost of maintenance, capital and breakdowns, and dividing this by the number of months it worked. If the AGV is maintained every month, breakdown costs nothing. Capital costs 100, maintenance costs 1000, the total cost is 1000 for the month. You can see this for the first month in column B. In column C, if the AGV is maintained every 2 months, breakdowns cost nothing in the first month plus 50 in the second month. Capital charge is 100 in the first month plus 200 in the second month. Maintenance cost 1000. The total cost is 1350 every 2 months or 675 per month. Next, if the AGV is maintained every 3 months, breakdowns cost 0 in the first, plus 50 in the second, plus 150 in the third month. Capital charge is 100 in the first, plus 200 in the second, plus 400 in the third month. Maintenance is 1000. The total is 1900 for 3 months or 633 a month. Repeating this gives the following values in this table, which suggests a minimum cost of $633 a month when maintenance is done every 3 months. So this is the best option. Even with regular maintenance, there comes a point when repairs are too expensive and it is cheaper to buy new equipment. These replacement decisions can be expensive when building a new logistics center, ship or shopping mall. Like maintenance, managers have to compromise on the timing of replacement. Too frequently results in efficient operations but high replacement costs. Too rarely gives low replacement costs but high operating and failure costs. So there is an optimal time for replacement, and we can find this by extending the analysis for preventive maintenance. In other words, we add the total cost of operating equipment over a number of years and divide this by the age of the replacement to give an average annual cost. This might show that the optimal policy is to replace delivery vans every 5 years or replace computer systems every 3 years. One drawback with plant replacement is that equipment is routinely replaced when it appears to be working well, in the way that computer equipment is replaced when it still looks new. Replacement inevitably causes some disruption while people get used to new equipment, so it can be difficult to persuade them that this really is better than waiting until the old equipment stops working. We discussed capacity planning, but this is not an end in itself. And the next stage is to show how the available capacity is used. In particular, managers have to design tactical aggregate plans and the master schedules, which give medium-term timetables for activities. This leads to the most detailed level of planning, which designs operational schedules for all resources. Tactical plans. Aggregate planning takes medium-term forecasts of demand and uses this to design plans for each type of activity for typically each of the next few months. Aggregate plans only look at families of activities and not at the details, so they might show the number of cases moved through a logistics center but do not break this down into types of case or contents. Aggregate planning makes the tactical decisions that translate forecast demand and available capacity into schedules for families of activities. Aggregate plans try to meet forecast demand while using supply chain capacity as efficiently as possible. Typically, they aim at low costs, high customer service, stable throughput, full utilization of resources, or some other objectives. To achieve these, they adjust a variable like the number of people employed, hours worked, amount of stock, amount subcontracted, resources available, and so on. At the end of the aggregate planning, an organization has schedules for its major types of activity, typically for each month at each location. The next stage is to add more detail, and this is done in the master schedules. A master schedule disaggregates the aggregate plan and shows the planned activities for typically each week over the next few weeks. Its aim is to achieve the activities described in aggregate plans as efficiently as possible. For both types of tactical plan, we can use the general procedure described in Lecture 3 as resource requirements planning. Remember that this has 6 steps: to find the resources needed, find the resources available, identify mismatches, find ways of overcoming the mismatch, compare options, and find the best and implement the best plan. We can show how this is used for tactical planning in the following example. ABC coaches plan its capacity in terms of coach days. They classify their business as either full day, which are long distance journeys, or half day, which are shorter runs. Forecasts show expected annual demand for the next 2 years to average 400,000 full-day passengers and 750,000 half-day passengers. ABC has 61 coaches, each with an effective capacity of 40 passengers a day for 300 days a year. Breakdowns and other unexpected problems reduce efficiency to 90%. They employ 86 drivers who work an average of 220 days a year, but illness and other absences reduce their efficiency to 85%. If there is a shortage of coaches, the company can buy extra ones for $220,000 or hire them for $100 a day. If there is a shortage of drivers, they can recruit extra ones at a cost of $40,000 a year or hire them from an agency for $220 a day. How can the company approach its tactical planning? Now let's use the 6-step procedure we just outlined. Step 1. Find the resources needed. We have 400,000 full-day passengers, which are equivalent to 10,000 coach days a year, or 33.33 coaches. We also have half-day passengers, which are equivalent to 31.25 coaches. Adding these two gives the total demand as 64.58 coaches. Each coach needs 300 divided by 220 drivers, so the company needs a total of 88.06 drivers. Now let's find the resources available. The company has 61 coaches, but the efficiency of 90% gives an availability of 54.9 coaches. Also, there are 86 drivers, but an efficiency of 85% reduces this to 73.1 drivers. In the next step, let's identify the mismatches. Without details of the timing, we can only take overall figures. There is a total shortage of 9.68 coaches and 14.96 drivers. What would be the possible plans for overcoming the mismatch? Assuming that the ABC do not want to reduce demand, they can either buy or hire coaches and employ drivers or hire them from an agency. The only information we have about these alternatives are some costs. To buy 10 coaches, this would cost $2,200,000. To hire coaches to make up shortage would cost $580,800 a year. There is of course the alternative of buying some coaches and hiring others. To hire 15 drivers, this would cost $600,000 a year, while using temporary drivers from an agency would cost $724,000 a year. There is also the option here of hiring some drivers and making up shortages from an agency. Now we have to choose the best option. We do not have enough information to make the final decisions, and we have only outlined a couple of alternatives. With more options and analysis, we might suggest a solution along the lines of buying 8 coaches and making up shortages by renting others, and hiring, for example, 12 drivers and making up the shortage from the agency. Implement the best option. When ABC have finalized their decision, they can implement them, which means turning the ideas into actions. A part of this is to add more details to the plans, moving to aggregate plans for types of journeys each month. The next stage of planning would break down the aggregate plans into master schedules of journeys, typically each week. And then the final step in planning would add the operational detail to the master schedule and show what each coach, driver, and all other resources are doing at any point. Remember that this approach has many practical difficulties, such as the way of generating and comparing alternatives. There are usually so many possible plans that we cannot even list them all, let alone compare their merits. And there are so many competing objectives and non-quantifiable factors that it is difficult to find any plan that satisfies everyone, let alone identify the best. An important point about planning is that it is never finished. It is continuous, and as plans for one period are finalized and implemented, planning moves on to the next period. The usual way of organizing this is to work on plans for several periods at the same time. Plans for the near future are fixed, while those for the more distant future are still tentative. Planning is then done in cycles. In one cycle, an organization might finalize plans for the next period and make provisional plans for the following periods and outline plans for the period after that. The so-called typical